Call of Juarez is a strange franchise. Gunslinger is the fourth game in the series, with the first game getting mixed reviews, the second game, Call of Juarez Bound in Blood, being a hit with generally positive reviews and over 1 million copies sold, and the third game, Call of Juarez The Cartel, being widely panned. The rest of the series' Metacritic reviews are in the 70s, with The Cartel's being 51 with a 3.4 user score. The Cartel was not only buggy and ugly, it was apparently also both racist and misogynist. According to Wikipedia, The Cartel's lead designer called the game, quote, a mistake, end quote. This background makes Gunslinger all the more interesting. It's kind of strange that the series continued after The Cartel, and after playing some of Techland's other games, Dead Island and Dying Light, it's clear that the studio can be a bit hit or miss. The game is set in the Wild West and features 3 game modes: the story campaign, an arcade mode, and duels. Before we get to specifics though, I want to briefly mention the visuals and sound design. I'm hardly an expert in either field, so I'll keep this brief. The sound design is in my view great. It sounds like a western should, and the gameplay specific sounds, like when the concentration bar is full, are clearly recognizable. The music is low key but very recognizably western, and really add to the western atmosphere. The visuals also mostly hold up due to the cel-shaded look the game has, and it generally looks very good, except at some point when the game is too bright and it looks a bit strange. Still, that's a minor flaw. Gunslinger's arcade mode features portions of story mode missions where the goal is to shoot all the enemies to get as high score as possible, instead of just getting to the end of the level. It's a surprisingly deep arcade mode with 3 classes which each feature 6 skills which are unlocked through using that class. The classes are the Trapper, which focuses on the shotgun and dynamite, Ranger, which focuses on the rifle, and the Gunslinger, which focuses on revolvers. The game features a combo system, which is the heart of arcade mode. When enemies are killed in quick succession, there's a score multiplier, and to keep the combo going, the player has to kill an enemy or shoot certain parts of the level, such as exploding barrels or pumpkins, before a timer represented by playing cards on the left of the screen runs out. Killing enemies gets the player concentration, which is essentially a time-limited bullet time, where living enemies are highlighted in red. Concentration also affects the combo countdown, making careful and strategic use of concentration essential to rack up high combos. There's another mechanic which charges up with kills, Sense of Death, which triggers when what would be a fatal shot makes the player enter a slow motion mode where you get one chance to dodge right or dodge left to avoid the bullet. How many points one gets for a kill depends on how the enemy is killed, with cumulative scores. Let me explain. A normal kill without a combo multiplier is worth 50 points. A headshot is worth 50 points, and a long shot kill is worth 50 points. So a long shot headshot kill is worth 150 points. When I first wrote the part about arcade mode, one of the only criticisms I had of it was that, to me, it seemed the Ranger class was the obvious pick, with better precision, better range, and a higher ammo count in the rifle than in any of the other guns. It seemed like the natural fit to dominate any arcade map. But after looking at the leaderboards, it turns out I'm wrong, so I have to commend Techland for producing not just the maps, but also the classes to be competitive in different situations. Arcade mode has been pretty downplayed in the reviews I've seen of the game, and I think that's a shame, because it's really a lot of fun, and it's intensely skill-based, which I appreciate in a shooter, which is on the whole very arcadey. Next up is the dueling mode. The duels mode is the mode I've spent the least time with. Not because it's a bad mode, I'm very impressed with the level of depth they managed to get for a mode built around classic cinematic cowboy duels, but it's because I'm not a very good jeweler. The system involves both positioning one's hand as close to the gun as possible with the A and D keys on PC to increase draw speed, and hovering the crosshair over the rival duelist's body to increase accuracy with the mouse. After a while, you begin to hear a heartbeat, which signals that you're ready to draw. While this is a fun system, the real depth comes in what's next. If you draw as soon as you can, you're branded dishonorable, meaning a lower score. So if you want to get a good score, you have to wait for your enemy to draw first, making the duel much more difficult. After drawing, you enter a slow motion mode where you have to shoot your opponent from the hip with a higher accuracy in the staring down phase, making the crosshair smaller. So the prep phase doesn't just determine if you're fast enough, you also need to hit your opponent, and if they have time to fire, you'll have to dodge their bullet while trying to shoot them. The duel mode gives the player 5 lives to win 15 consecutive duels. If your only goal is to progress through the 15 opponents, then you can play dishonorably, but that will give you a score of 0. So, if you want a good score, you'll have to wait for your opponent to draw first. Without spoiling too much, the mode features some really interesting stages. There's one with explosives. There's also one with 2 opponents. Duels isn't my favorite, but it's a very well designed system, and it's far deeper than it needs to be, or even I would expect it to be. I want to take some time to comment on the current discussion of Call of Juarez Gunslinger here on YouTube, or more precisely, the lack thereof. The videos I've seen so far from November Hotel, G-Man Lives, Jarek the Gaming Dragon, and Total Biscuit all praise the game. And G-Man Lives even calls it the best in the Call of Juarez series. IGN mainly praises the game, but calls the dueling mechanic, quote, a major misfire, unquote, while showing footage when the player has 5% draw speed. I'm not interested in bringing back the debate about whether games journalists have to be good at games, but I can't help but feel like that specific criticism comes from misunderstanding the systems rather than poor game design. I think it's a real shame that there's so little real discussion of the game, and especially how it makes gunfights so engaging. The consensus here on YouTube seems to be that it's a good arcade shooter with fun, if not overly serious story, which is all true, but I think it's worth discussing what makes the game good, not just stating that it is. Here are some of the things I noticed on my latest playthrough. First off, Gunslinger takes care to be mechanically legible. All the enemies have distinct and brightly colored details in their outfits, like for example scarves, making them much easier to spot. And when that enemy dies, the color drains out of their details, making it easy to tell dead and living enemies apart, which is very important in such a high-paced game as Gunslinger. I really like how the game isn't afraid to give the player very powerful upgrades in its story mode, like infinite ammo for shotguns in concentration, or giving the player the option to split their thrown dynamite into 3 sticks of dynamite, which each deals the same damage as 1 normal stick of dynamite, effectively tripling your number of grenades. Gunslinger knows that its campaign is short, so it encourages replayability by having a new game plus, collectibles, and an unlockable difficulty, True West, which I played on my latest playthrough in preparation for this video. And the overpowered upgrades in the story mode are okay because the story mode is so short. The game tries to be fun and arcadey, so it doesn't matter if Silas is overpowered. What matters is if the player's having fun. Alright, let's get to the story mode. It's fairly short, with 14 missions, and How Long to Beat averages the playtime at 6 hours for the game, but I think the story mode is probably more like 4 hours long. The story follows Silas Greaves, bounty hunter and gunslinger extraordinaire, who travels to the small town of Abilene, Kansas, on the trail of his nemesis, Roscoe Bob Brandt. The game's framing device is having Silas rest at a saloon where a young man named Dwight recognizes Silas's name as a famous bounty hunter and asks Silas to tell stories of when he met and faced off with the Wild West's legendary bandits. The story in Gunslinger is a lot of fun, and while it won't ruin your enjoyment of the story to know how it ends, I would recommend going into the game blind if you intend to play it. At the saloon, there are a couple of more characters who comment on Silas's tales. Jack, the skeptic, Ben, the barman, Molly, the bartender, and Steve, the old man. The narrative is not chronological, but over the course of the game we find out that Silas is somewhat of a Forrest Gump of the Old West, having run into almost every famous gunslinger this side of the Mississippi, and eventually he reveals why he became a bounty hunter. When he was young, his brothers and he used to bring cattle from Texas to Juarez, Mexico, where one day Silas won big in a poker game against 3 strangers, the most unusual winning being an old Spanish gold coin. The next day, when they're returning to Texas, the Greaves brothers get robbed by the same strangers from the poker game, and before Bob Bryant intends to hang the brothers, he places the Spanish coin in Silas's mouth and says,
"I won't have it said that I left you with nothing, boy."
Silas survives the incident and vows revenge against the 3 killers, Roscoe Bob Bryant, Jim Reed, and Johnny Ringo. The story then follows Silas as he guns down every mythic figure in the West over the course of 50 years on his hunt for revenge. The game uses the framing device of Silas telling the saloon gang of his legendary exploits to great effect, changing levels as Silas changes his story and using it for great comedic effect as well. For example, at one point when the player is on a train trying to reach the engine car, Silas goes for a bathroom break, at which point the player character keeps going through the same cart until Silas is back to continue the story. One of my favorite aspects of the game's storytelling is how it uses the characters of Jack and Dwight to act as the skeptic and the believer respectively, which makes sure that Silas's story is neither constantly challenged nor always taken at face value. The actual events of Silas's tales are almost interchangeable. Every story is about tracking down them ne'er-do-wells and shooting folks. It's up to each player and each character in the saloon to decide if they believe Silas or not. The reason all of this works is because the voice acting is so good. All the characters are very well acted. It even features Sam Riegel, who you might know as Teddy from Persona 4 or from Critical Role. Spoiler warning ahead. The story is, at its most basic level, the tale of revenge, but it's more interested in the tale of the monster hunter than to be the Count of Monte Kansas. To paraphrase Nietzsche, whoever hunts bounties should see to it that in the process he does not become a bounty. Silas's long career comes to a head in the last level, which is appropriately set in a ghost town and a graveyard, where he fights the ghost of the dead outlaws he met during the game. Silas questions if revenge was worth it, and if by pursuing it, he has become worse than the man he swore to kill. The game is very linear, with the only real narrative choice given to the player is whether or not to kill Roscoe Bob Bryant, or, as we knew him all along, Ben the bartender. While the choice is pretty straightforward, with a clear good and bad choice, it's still appropriate, and more choice than I would have expected in such a linear game, though I realize that my standards might just be too low. The major theme of the game is myth. Few periods are as romanticized and mythic as the Wild West, at least in North American history. Silas, being an unreliable narrator, is used cleverly throughout the game, and the further you progress, the more you might start to think that Jack is right. This old man isn't actually Silas Greaves, just some old-timer trying to get free drinks. But the Ben is Bob twist really shakes up the story. When stories use unreliable narrators, it's easy to make the twist that the narrator wasn't telling it straight, but Gunslinger cleverly subverts this by making the twist that Silas is partly telling the truth. But all this muddling of fact and fiction doesn't end when the narration is dropped at the end of the game, which I haven't seen commented on by anyone else. In both of the endings, we find out that young Dwight is none other than Dwight Eisenhower, who would go on to be the US 34th president. So even when the unreliable narration framing devices drop, the story features legendary bounty hunter Silas tracking down legendary outlaw Bob Bryant to a small town in Kansas where he meets Eisenhower, proceeds to tell his life's tale, and kill or spare his great nemesis. Sounds like a legend if ever I heard one. I could have made this video longer and talked about more lovely details, like how the game foreshadows its ending through what seems like innocuous comments by Silas, or about the beautiful comic book style introductions to the Wild West's bandits and outlaws, or about how its writing manages to reduce ludonarrative dissonance by using unreliable narration. But I don't want to give away more than I already have. Call of Juarez Gunslinger is a very good game, but very underrated. It's short, it's relatively cheap, and laser focused, and I would recommend it to almost anyone. Join me next time when we swap the sunny Wild Wild West for snowy New York, but it will be far wilder than any tall tale Silas can dream up. I guarantee it.